and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. My name is Elliot Waldman, and I'm an associate editor here at WPR. Before we dive into today's interview, just a quick reminder to tune in again on Friday for our editor's discussion, looking at the week's top headlines. One of the most contentious elements of the U.S. China relationship today concerns the Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei and its outsized role in the build-out of next-generation 5G telecommunications infrastructure around the world. President Donald Trump's administration argues that Huawei's close ties to the Chinese government make it a national security risk, and last summer it added Huawei to a blacklist that prevents American companies from doing business with it. U.S. officials have urged other countries to avoid Huawei as well. That campaign has seen some success in places like Japan and Australia, but European countries have been less willing to go along. The UK recently announced that it would allow Huawei to take a limited role in building out its 5G infrastructure, potentially giving cover to other major European countries to do the same. The White House is also reportedly ramping up its efforts to develop a homegrown alternative to Huawei, enlisting major technology and telecommunications firms in a joint effort. But is it all too little, too late? Joining me now to discuss the debate over Huawei and the future of 5G is Emily Taylor. She's an expert in cybersecurity policy and the CEO of Oxford Information Labs, and she's also an associate fellow in the International Security Program at Chatham House in London. Emily, welcome to Trendlines.
Hi, Elliot.
So let's start with a look at the current state of play. Just how dominant of a position does Huawei have in the growing market for 5G technology?
Given all the noise that's been surrounding Huawei and the controversy around it over the last year or so, you would be forgiven for thinking that it's the only 5G provider in the world, but that's not the case. It's true that it is a very limited market with only a few players in it. So on 5G, Huawei claims to have 60 commercial contracts, which span many countries, and to have shipped 400,000 masts and 150,000 base stations. But its two competitors in Europe, particularly, are Ericsson and Nokia. Both of them provide services internationally and infrastructure internationally. So Ericsson actually has more patents for 5G than Huawei does, and it claims to have 80 commercial 5G agreements, so that's more than Huawei. Nokia on a par, I think, both in terms of the number of patents that it has, and it's just slightly ahead on the number of commercial 5G contracts with 65 plus. So there are competitors. There are not that many competitors in the world. And I think one of the things that really makes the 5G story unusual is that because 5G will be sitting on top of existing mobile infrastructure, a country's choices are really limited depending on how much Huawei is already involved in providing its 4G or 3G infrastructure.
So what does that mean for other countries that the United States has been pressuring to avoid Huawei? I'm thinking not only of the United Kingdom, which announced its decision recently, but also countries like Germany, which is grappling with this decision.
For countries that are considering what to do with their 5G infrastructure, have quite difficult choices to make and many different and contradictory imperatives. Most countries see 5G as a very important technology that's going to benefit their economies, innovation, their businesses, and potentially provide better connectivity for rural communities as well. So there's a real imperative to get those networks built out as quickly as possible and have your country able to compete on international markets. At the same time, of course, price is important. Not all of the mobile operators are that financially well off. BT in the United Kingdom, for example, has a significant pension deficit, and a lot of the mobile companies have been struggling with the long-term effect of early auctions of spectrum in the 3G and 4G worlds. So price is another important point, but also national security. And this is the issue that has really been brought to bear with US pressure, but also independent voices over the last year. the relationship between Huawei and the state of China has always been called into question by its critics, and at the same time, Huawei denies having close links to the Chinese state. But just say it did have those links. Having a hostile state embedded at a very low level of your critical communications infrastructure is never a good look. And a lot of countries have been raising concerns about what are the risks involved, particularly when you have a 5G network that's going to be unlike most of its predecessors. It's going to be a much more intelligent network, much more software driven. And so, in technical terms, we talk about the intelligence being much more at the core of the network than we've previously seen. With that complexity comes security risks, as does the kind of devices that will be connected to the mobile infrastructure for the first time. We will see a lot of Internet of Things devices, which are often poorly secured. All of these things add up to a much more difficult security equation than has perhaps been the case in previous versions of mobile infrastructure technologies.
I want to follow up on that, but before we do, you mentioned the issue of price. How exactly do Huawei's prices compare with the other competitors you mentioned, like Nokia and Ericsson?
The impression is that Huawei is a lot cheaper on price than its competitors. There are also so at Oxford Information Labs we did a study on Huawei and 5G last year, and we found as part of that there are unusual pricing incentives that for example, take place as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. For example, in Mexico, a 1% interest loan with the Bank of China was offered on the condition that 80% of the funding was spent with Huawei when they were building out their 4G network. And in Brazil, Huawei bid on a radio network project and provided the broadband network service and support at no additional charge. So there are more ways of offering cut prices than others, or than might first appear. So we're seeing some quite predatory type of pricing behaviour, but also I think that the base cost is generally felt to be lower than with competitors Nokia and Ericsson.
That's interesting. The idea of an incentive that's bundled with another major Chinese company in the same sector does sort of call into question Huawei's argument that it has no links to the government.
Yes, and its critics would point to those examples. It's worth stating for balance that Huawei does deny those links and says that it is a private company owned by its employees.
So for allies and partners of the U.S., they've been hearing from Washington, this argument all along that it's an espionage risk, that there are national security concerns. How valid are those concerns exactly? I mean, you mentioned that it's not a good look, so the perceptions are not great. But how much of a danger is there actually by allowing Huawei into a country's 5G infrastructure?
The concerns are definitely plausible. You've got an infrastructure provider that's providing not just sort of pipes and wires, but an intelligent network. You're going to have a long-term relationship with that vendor, whether you like it or not. So the potential is there. When you're at a low level in a network, you have a privileged position. Internet service providers, people who are providing access networks have a very close connection with the traffic flows that are going over their network. So definitely the opportunity is there if the provider chooses to abuse that opportunity. But in the US, one of the problems is that we have these concerns that are being voiced, but it's like, well, we have these concerns, but obviously we can't give you the evidence because it's secret or it's classified. On the other hand, the UK, which has been working with Huawei in our infrastructure for over 15 years, has an evaluation centre which the whole purpose is to take these pieces of equipment apart and find out how they work, find out that they're not doing anything weird or extra. The UK has evidence published last year of, quote, serious and systemic defects in Huawei's software engineering and cybersecurity competence. But the same report goes out of its way to say that there's no evidence of state involvement or deliberate wrongdoing. And so you have really different narratives coming from these two Five Eyes partners who've had very close intelligence sharing for many years and very closely aligned allies. So you have to question why the narrative is so different. And also, if the US did have evidence of wrongdoing relating to Huawei, why do the UK not seem to be sharing in that evidence or party to that evidence? So there's that. There's also a very practical point, which is that you don't need to provide a network in order to compromise it. We see day in, day out, large scale hacks or compromises, sometimes by states, sometimes by organized criminal gangs. And there isn't a one-to-one correlation between those bad actors and the providers of the networks. And unfortunately, networks, applications, devices are all too easy to compromise these days because the general level of cybersecurity, our cyber hygiene, if you will, is at a much lower level than it should be.
What kind of steps could governments take, and also providers and vendors for that matter, to improve that cyber hygiene and make it more difficult for state actors to use this kind of infrastructure for espionage purposes?
So I think that the approach that has been taken to date by the UK, but also by countries like Norway and Italy, which is a sort of cautious evidence-based approach, is the right one, which is to say, well, actually, all technology, particularly critical infrastructure, is vulnerable. So let's just treat it as vulnerable and make sure that we take a quality assurance approach and a risk management approach. Let's make sure that we know as much about the kit that we're running on as possible. And there's a specialist evaluation centre in the UK to do just that. Now, query whether a small staff of under 50 people is going to be capable of getting its arms around hundreds of millions of lines of computer code, but I think it goes towards a good idea, which is of quality assurance. Another aspect is to have a multi-vendor strategy. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. There are lots of risks associated with having a single vendor, whether they be espionage concerns or actually just vendor lock-in or the failure of that vendor at a later date. This infrastructure is going to be around for a while, so minimize your risk by using multiple vendors. And certainly the early rollouts of commercial 5G offerings that we've seen in this country have all adopted a multi-vendor approach.
That was definitely the case with the UK government's recent decision to allow Huawei and other so-called high-risk telecommunications vendors to participate in their networks with certain restrictions. And the EU also announced similar guidelines for its member states recently, although those are non-binding and the ultimate decision will be up to national governments. But these moves were widely seen as a blow to the Trump administration's efforts, and Huawei quickly put out press releases welcoming the decisions. How did you assess the rationales behind those decisions, particularly the British government's?
Well, the British government's decision in relation to Huawei and 5G was long awaited, and it did seem to be put off several times by the former Prime Minister Theresa May and by the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And that's because it was a very, very difficult circle to square. You had vocal pressure from the closest ally, the US, threatening to withhold intelligence sharing and threatening to have an impact on the upcoming trade deal that the UK is hoping to strike with the US now that it's left the European Union. So the US administration really did its best to ramp up the political pressure as much as possible. But there was also other factors at play, and the fact that the UK really had very little room for manoeuvre. Now, in the case of the EU announcement and the UK, commercial offerings of 5G have been on the market for some months prior to any national decision or a decision of the EU about what to do with Huawei and 5G. So, as so often happens in technology markets, the market is way ahead of policy decisions. And so there's already Huawei providing 5G in the UK along with other partners. And so the the fact that the UK, unlike the US, already has Huawei deeply embedded in its 4G infrastructure meant that it was pretty inevitable that Huawei was going to be part of the 5G solution. That said, I think that the announcement went out of its way to try to address American concerns. For example, but it didn't need to label Huawei as a high risk vendor, but it did. It didn't need to limit the market share that Huawei could have, but it did do so. In fact, I think the market cap is more or less what it would naturally get in the market in any event. But still, that is some sort of gesture to say, look, we are aware of your concerns, we do take them seriously. But in the end, there were reports, I don't know whether or not they're true, but reports of a quote apoplectic phone call between Donald Trump and the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson after the UK announcement.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like the UK's decision was in a way preordained by the reality of the market.
Yeah, quite often when you look at these difficult decisions closely, the reality is that there's not much room for manoeuvre. I think one of the interesting aspects of the UK's position is how it conflicts with the US and also Australia. So the UK is restricting Huawei to non-core. And there's a blog by the National Cybersecurity Centre's technical people explaining what exactly they mean by core. Meanwhile, Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister of Australia, is saying, well, with 5G, the core is no more. And that highlights an argument, which is that, in 5G, you can't really make the same distinction that you used to be able to, that by saying, antennae, masts, that sort of thing, they're not really that sensitive. They're just pretty dumb. And as long as you're not in the backbone of the network itself, you should be fine. With 5G, there are arguments to say that distinction doesn't apply, but the National Cybersecurity Centre specifically takes issue with those arguments, I must say, with a very carefully defined version of what core actually means.
So what does core actually mean? Because this is something I was wondering too when I was reading some of the coverage. It's not immediately clear to a layperson what you kind of imagine this giant humming machine in the center of some cavernous room, but what exactly is it?
I used to think I knew, but now I'm not so sure that I understand. And actually, we're seeing also different definitions of what core means. So, the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, which is an offshoot of our Signals Intelligence Service, GCHQ, they really define core as meaning highly sensitive government networks in which you would be transmitting, say, classified, secret and top secret information. Other definitions of core that I have been looking at are really more about the software component of 5G, what makes 5G different to its predecessors, in that whereas before we used to talk about the core of networks being quite dumb, now the core will be much more intelligent. It will be capable of ramping up using cloud services in response to demand, and also in future there will be opportunities to do what they call network slicing. So you would almost have different networks able to coexist using the same facilities. Now, what the British security experts, National Security Cybersecurity Centre, say is actually this whole thing about 5G being more intelligent is just rubbish, because with masts and antennae, you'd always have a lot of software determining how that mast handles and transmits communications and data. And of course, that makes sense as well. But I think that what makes 5G different to its predecessors is that it's going to be a much more organic feeling type of network, in that it will be able to reduce and expand its capacity in response to demand.
And just for our listeners who might not be as familiar, what are some of the main applications of 5G technology?
5G technology will, or promises to be, the great enabler of the so-called Internet of Things, like smart cities, grid networks. And so it's going to be offering very, very high speeds that we mainly now sort of associate with fixed line, the sort of thing where you could download a movie in seconds rather than just staring at your phone for hours when you're on 3G. And that you'll also, as well as having the the traditional sense of going online that we still do, you would also have a lot more machine to machine type of communication that we would associate with so-called smart cities. So much more things much more like traffic management, a lot more of the wearables, the smart cars, and so on. 5G will be the network that is capable of serving all of those multiple devices at the same time at very, very high speeds.
And it's exactly that quality of embeddedness in so many aspects of our lives that makes it a high national security concern, right?
That's right. There are many concerns that arise with 5G. The complexity, the sort of unknown quantity, if you like, of the way that network will behave, particularly when you attach all sorts of fairly poorly secured devices to it. Up until now, mobile operators, there's mobile handsets, really. There are lots of different types of mobile handsets, but they're reasonably well made. There's a limited number of manufacturers, and they behave in fairly predictable ways. Um, Now, you've got baby cameras, you've got wearables, smart cars, smart cities, you name it. And generally, the experience in the market is that smart devices are not that smart on cybersecurity.
I want to ask you about these reports that have emerged recently in the U.S. of a new push by a consortium of American companies backed by the Trump administration to develop a homegrown alternative to Huawei for 5G. And that involves companies like Microsoft, Dell, AT&T. But I didn't hear you mention any American companies when you were listing alternatives to Huawei earlier on. So what would need to happen for American firms to compete on a level playing field with Huawei?
I think there's been a lot of soul searching in the United States, because unlike almost any other technology environment you can think of, there isn't a global competitor for 5G infrastructure from the United States. So there have been various reactions to that. In some quarters, you see US voices saying, well, let's put all of our efforts into creating a great 6G in global competitor, but that involves leapfrogging, if you like, from 5G to the next technology, and there's no knowing what damage might be done in the market, or which direction the technology might turn in the meanwhile. But there have been real efforts to try and break the stranglehold of vendor lock-in. This is actually a very small market. We've been talking about Nokia, Ericsson, Huawei. Samsung is also a competitor, and Qualcomm in the United States has got a lot of patents, but actually there's still not an awful lot of choice. And one of the main concerns is that you get locked into a vendor. So there are efforts to create a new type of competitor using open technologies to create general purpose, vendor neutral hardware. And in the UK, Vodafone has been investing pretty heavily in those technologies, and it recently announced trials in the UK, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Mozambique. There are similar initiatives in the United States, and I think actually a collaboration between the US and UK to pursue this sort of thinking could well be fruitful and could solve the real underlying issue behind a lot of this controversy, which is the lack of choice for countries and mobile operators when they want to build out their 5G networks.
It raises an interesting question because it seems like a lot of the reason that Huawei is able to compete at the level it's competing and offer such low prices is simply because of the massive amounts of state subsidies that it's received. And other countries' economies simply just aren't structured in a way to allow such massive state involvement. So is this kind of a case where the sort of market-oriented logic might need to be rethought?
When you look at the figures claimed for Huawei, it starts to look very depressing if you are a competitor. They say that more than 80,000 employees are involved in R&D. That's 45% of their workforce, and that it's investing 14% of revenue in research and development. You compare that to Ericsson, which claims to have 4,000 engineers involved in R&D, and you start to see what you're up against. But as well as those public claims, there have always been concerns about the links between Huawei and the Chinese state, and in particular the incentives given to states to use Huawei's equipment. Sometimes you will see that as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, money or finance or investment is offered by China in return for investment in Huawei. Now, that's not really something that Western competitors are able to rely upon. We've also seen, as part of Chinese state strategies, that in the long term you see loan practices that can undermine sustainable financing or have been criticized for undermining sustainable financing and sometimes result in China's acquisition of valuable national resources. There's an example where China assumed shares in a Sri Lankan port in return for over $500 million in debt forgiveness. Now, these sort of activities are not really the kind of things that Western countries can compete with. And so there is a real argument that there is not an even playing field between Huawei and its Western competitors because of the interplay with the state.
Are there any flashpoints on the horizon that you'll be keeping your eye on in this issue?
One of the things that I've been really worrying about, and maybe I shouldn't, is what all of this does to very important strategic intelligence sharing networks. Now, in public, the Trump administration, and particularly Secretary of State Pompeo and the president himself, have expressly threatened to limit intelligence sharing, not just with allies like Germany, but with the UK, which is a sort of in this special circle of the Five Eyes, and that's an intelligence sharing network. When you speak to members of the intelligence community, they downplay the risk. Oh no, it's too strong. The sort of relationships, they're not just formal. They run to personal relationships. This is a really, really close network in which the UK is also a net provider of information as well as a recipient of it. But if these threats really are continued through this administration, perhaps into a second term, how how confident can the intelligence services be that they can continue to operate in that close way if their political masters say they shouldn't? And that, for me, is a real security threat to our national security and to the international security in the West. Because if you limit intelligence sharing on the basis that you have cybersecurity concerns, for a start, it seems a self-defeating exercise, because the objective surely should be to protect yourselves and your allies against known cybersecurity risks throughout your networks.
Emily, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Emily Taylor is the CEO of Oxford Information Labs and an Associate Fellow in the International Security Program at Chatham House in London. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter. It's the best way to keep up with what we're publishing, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.